Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hi everyone, and welcome to Room by Room, the home organisation Science Insights podcast, produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element, with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Gabriella Yastra, coming to you from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's begin.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Sabrina Oktavelia. High energy bills and carbon footprints are weighing on homeowners' pockets more than ever. Luckily, there's a way to save money and go green at the same time. Fully electric homes. With solar panels, battery storage, and smart appliances, making the switches easier than we might think. Today, we're going to be exploring all the ins and outs for the topic: greener, fully electric homes, how to make the energy transition at home. Guiding us today is David Roche, Research Director for Strategic Energy Collaborations at the Institute for Sustainable Futures, University of Technology, Sydney. With over 25 years of experience in clean energy technology and commercialization, David has played a pivotal role in advancing renewable energy solutions, from managing Australia's first grid-connected photovoltaic system to mentoring startups at UTS Energy Lab, a leader in net zero strategy and distributed energy systems. So, welcome, David.
Yeah, thank you, Sabrina. Lovely to be here.
Thank you very much for coming and accepting our invitation to come. Can you tell me a little bit more on how you become a research director?
Yeah, thanks. So I began my academic career at the University of New South Wales. And some of you may know the University of New South Wales as a leader in solar cell research.
Mm-hmm.
So I worked with that group under Professor Martin Green, making some of the world's most efficient solar cells. And now the solar cell technology that we were working on then 20 or 30 years ago is the solar cell technology used in over, I think it's 80% now of solar panels around the world. So I started in energy research. I then sort of left the university and spent about 20 years consulting to industry, working with startups. And then a few years ago, decided to come back into the energy space, and at UTS found a role as a kind of this bridge between academic research and industry, which is where a lot of my career has been spent. So yeah, working with the Energy Futures team there. There's a lot happening in Australia on the energy transition, particularly around things like electrification and electric homes. And so found a role there, working with a bunch of really talented researchers to assist, particularly Australia, in terms of making energy transition.
Wow. So you are part of the journey of creating those solar cells that we use all over the world.
That's right. Yeah. So the solar cell tech, what's called the PERC cell structure, was invented at UNSW. And so part of the work that I did when I was there was managing a pilot line where we're making those cells, very expensive versions of those cells for niche applications like solar racing cars. But that technology has then been commercialized and is now the most common technology employed around the world. And while I was there, and also through my consulting work, did a lot of work on not just on the cells, but particularly the systems. So most of my work has actually been on not so much solar cell technology, but on how we integrate solar technology into our grids. So things like inverters, some of the early work on grid-connected inverters in Australia, and then the systems around that. So things like standards, grid connection agreements, and even the incentive programs that we have in Australia for solar cells, which we still have today. So played a pivotal role in developing that system based on, for example, postcodes to calculate how much incentive you
Mm,
can receive for installing a solar panel.
I see. So you are doing mostly on the systems and the maths behind these technologies and solar cells.
Yeah, the big part of it is.
I see. And what sparked your interest and started your journey in this sustainability role?
Yeah, well, it's obviously, from the 80s when I began at university. there was a big concern around greenhouse gas emissions and global warming, and so that was a real focus for my interest. And certainly doing work with the solar cell research group was a big part of that.
Hmm.
Why I was interested in being part of that group, and as well as that, it's just a really interesting, cool technology. And as an engineer by background, I was really interested in exploring that as well. So yeah, it's sort of perfect match of technology, but also with a purpose.
Technology with a purpose. I really like that statement. And before we get into the topic of the day, we are going to go to this section we call Have You Met David? So we are going to get to know you a little bit before we start so that our audience knows you a little bit on what you do and what you enjoy. So, David, what is your favorite book?
Yeah, thanks. Actually, people might get a slightly wrong impression of me given the answers to some of these questions. But I just recently reread a book by Cormac McCarthy called The Road, which some of your listeners may know.
Oh,
Um, quite a quite a dark
I
dystopian
read
book,
that
but
book.
a great read. Yeah. It's quite a short read, but a brilliantly written
Mhm.
book, and a very it was a story that I read maybe 10 years ago and really kind of stayed with me. So I just recently read it over the holiday. So that's one that I'll come back to that stands the test of time, definitely.
Yeah, I read that in high school for my English class. So that's quite
Okay.
interesting.
You probably have a somewhat different perspective being forced to read it versus reading it for pleasure. So.
It was indeed enjoyable because I did take English. And what
Mm.
movie have you enjoyed recently?
Yeah, well, again, somewhat dystopian, but
Hmm.
Children of Men, which is another. I mean, I like good sci-fi movies, so things like the new Dune movies are great. But Children of Men is a movie. Alfonso Cuarón, I think, is the director, and just some of the cinematography in that is just spectacular. And I think the movie itself really stands up as well. It's a great story.
I see. And I think it shows that you're human and you're not just, a researcher that's only fully focused on doing your work and changing the world for the better. And are you listening to any podcasts at the moment?
Yeah, I listen to a lot of podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I won't list all of them. One that I quite like, which probably says something about me, is Skeptic's Guide to the Universe.
Mm.
SU. It's one of the bigger science podcasts. But it's not just about science; it's about critical thinking. So a lot of my interests are in that space as well. So not just about what we know, but how we know what we know, and those sorts of things, and making sure we avoid certain pitfalls in the way we think about things.
Mm.
So yeah, it's a great podcast.
That's really interesting indeed. And do you have any role model that has guided you through what you do now?
Uh, Maybe not so much guiding me, but certainly people I look up to and admire. I was thinking of someone like Darwin, who's a just fantastic scientist I really look up to, and but yeah, sort of continuing the skeptics guide kind of theme. I think
Hmm.
Carl Sagan, in terms of science communication, I think was a great role model in that space. And yeah, an astronomer, which is an area that I've always been interested in, and fantastic science communicator. So he's one who really inspires me as well.
I see. And last question for this segment is there a course that has inspired you?
Yeah, look, as I mentioned that I have an engineering background,
Hmm.
so I did engineering, which I enjoyed. Also have a Bachelor of Arts, and I do a Master of Science in philosophy of biology. And so I guess I might mention that because it's something that's a little bit different to the engineering type work. And so that was something that I found pretty inspirational, and working on again a sort of topic related to sustainability in that. So that was a course that inspired me.
Yeah, that's interesting. Philosophy and biology. I don't really think of the philosophy in terms of biology, just did biology. So that is quite an
Well,
interesting
it's about
course.
yeah. It's I mean, philosophy of science in general
Hmm.
is, again, back to this question of like, how do we know what we know,
Hmm.
and I think is a really big, important part of that. And I think philosophy of biology is really about trying to understand like the concepts of biology. It's really digging into what do we mean when we talk about levels of selection, or what about environmental ethics, for example, is
Mm.
part of that as well. And the topic I was looking at was actually biodiversity, and what do we mean by biodiversity? How do we measure it?
Mm.
So that was kind of a digging into that in a fairly deep way. Was quite satisfying.
Lovely. Okay, so we can go into topic for the day. For starters, how would you define home organization?
Yeah, well, I guess as I mentioned, my background as an engineer, I sort of think about homes in terms of like the services that you have in a home, particularly again your appliances that are providing services to you, and as well as in modern days, it's not just the service within the home, but things like the vehicle that can connect into your home for charging, and the solar panels on your roof that can provide power to the home. So, thinking about home organization, I guess, in terms of making sure that we have our home organized in a way that really um, that serves us. So
Mm,
rather than us being a slave to the home, clearing out gutters and doing all those boring things around the home, but
yeah,
actually thinking about the home being organized in a way that it can provide for our daily needs, and make living in our homes better.
I see. So making our homes work for us instead of us working for it. And
Yeah, that's right, and that's
mhm,
a big part of what we're going to be talking about, which is electrified homes. Is doing that. It's just making our homes better homes to live in.
I see. And secondarily, how would you define sustainability?
Yeah, obviously, there's a few different ways we think about sustainability in terms of for example, financial sustainability. But if we're talking about environmental sustainability, then it obviously means treading lightly on the earth in terms of our impacts. And the main one we focus on today, but it's only one of many impacts that we have on the earth. But we focus a lot on greenhouse gas emissions, and
Mm,
certainly in the energy sector, that's kind of the main impact that electricity generation can have, particularly generation through fossil fuels. So ways we can reduce that impact, and obviously sustainable energy, solar panels, and so on is part of that reduction. So moving towards zero emissions technologies is one way to make our homes much more sustainable.
I see. So moving to a greener energy, and how would you describe the relationship between sustainability and home organization?
Yeah, I guess it's we all kind of play this role, I suppose, in making our homes more sustainable. So we can go through it in a little bit later, but certainly thinking about the technologies that we need in our home to make it more sustainable.
Mm,
So those electric technologies, the heat pump water heaters and was reverse cycle air conditioners, for example. And so I think organization is also relevant to maybe there's some barriers to installing those technologies. So thinking about how do we organize our homes so we can actually incorporate those technologies into our homes. And for
that's
those
right.
in, for example, apartments and so on, where it's not a freestanding home, there's some additional barriers there, and thinking about perhaps some innovative solutions there, where, for example, you may not have solar panels on your roof, but
Yeah.
maybe you could, become part of a solar garden, for example, so you can get access to cheap solar energy a different way.
Why is it important for us to move into and do sustainability?
Yeah, well, it's obviously important in terms of maintaining the health of our planet, and in the context of electrification, I think that's only one of the reasons why it's a good idea to electrify our homes and make them fully electric. So it's as well as being better for the planet, and that's a motivation enough for many people.
Hmm.
It's also it saves money and it's better for our health. So there's three really good reasons to go for an electric home. And so in terms of saving money, obviously having solar panels on your roof, you're generating your own electricity. Solar panels are now cheap enough that that
Hmm.
is a very cost-effective way to generate electricity for most people. In the Australian context, where we do a lot of our work, there's quite a few homes still connected to gas. And natural gas is obviously it's a fossil fuel, so it's a pollutant, and it's mostly methane. So if there's leaking of that gas into the atmosphere, it's also a greenhouse gas. But burning it releases carbon dioxide, and it's getting more expensive. So going off gas altogether and just having a fully electric home using electricity to meet our basic needs is actually a much cheaper home to run. And then, of course, with electric vehicles now, they're getting the capital cost is coming down for
Hmm.
electric vehicles, and the running cost is much lower than it is for a petrol vehicle. So we often think about electric homes as including electric vehicle as well, sort of integrated into the home in terms of charging.
I see. So we did talk about a little bit about electric homes and electric vehicles, and what does it mean to have a fully electric home? What does it entail?
Yeah, so if we think about what are the main appliances in a home that aren't electric, that are using fossil fuels,
Hmm.
there's, in terms of the ones in the home, there would be three main appliances. So they are gas for space heating, gas for water heating, and then gas for cooking in the home. So they're the kind of three main appliances in the home that use fossil fuels. And then there's a kind of fourth appliance, which is the car in the garage, which is the other one that's using fossil fuels typically. So if we think about those four appliances, they're the kind of four things we need to electrify to make our homes cheaper to run, better for the environment,
Hmm.
and we only just touched on it, but certainly better for your health. So we didn't talk about the health implications, particularly of cooking with gas in homes, as well as using unflued heaters inside homes.
Mm.
They're a source of things like nitrous oxides and other indoor air pollutants,
Ah.
and they have quite a deleterious effect on things like asthma and other health conditions. So a lot of
Mm.
work has been done showing that burning things inside your home is generally not a good idea for your health, and electricity is a much cleaner way to provide those services. So we can dive into I guess each of those topics in a bit more detail if you like. So we can talk about for example, space heating, water heating, etc., and what are the kind of the technologies that are available
Yeah.
to meet the needs of those. So in the case, if we start with, say, space heating, that's probably one of the easier ones where if you're using gas to heat your home,
Hmm.
you can just replace that with a reverse cycle air conditioner, or in many other countries, it's referred to as a heat pump. So essentially, it's a relatively efficient way of extracting heat from the air, typically, although sometimes they're ground source heat pumps,
Mm.
and we can use the electricity to pump heat from outside the home to inside the home. Very efficient technology and much more cost effective these days than using gas, as well as all those other health benefits. So that's one technology. And I should also mention the other great benefit of a reverse cycle air conditioner is if you live in a climate like Sydney, where I live,
Yeah.
it's quite cold in winter, but it's also quite hot and humid in summer. And so that reverse cycle air conditioner has two uses. It can both heat and cool your home. That's not just for heating, whereas gas can only heat. So that's a pretty straightforward one. For water heating, gas is used in Australia. It's a fairly high proportion of homes still use gas for water heating,
Ah.
and so the obviously the technologies there are electric technologies for heating water. So there's old school, resistance type water heaters that have been around for a long time. Very reliable technology. They are very flexible. We can talk about that. It's kind of a really important thing in our modern grids, having loads that can be switched on and off
Yeah.
to best match when solar is generating. And then we also have things like heat pumps. So this is a newer technology, very similar to your reverse cycle air conditioner. So it's running a heat pump, which is, we've got a heat pump in our refrigerator. There's a heat pump in our reverse cycle air conditioner, and there's a heat pump
Oh.
you can put into a water heater. So it's the same technology. It's essentially taking heat energy from the air, in the case of an air source heat pump, and it's moving that heat into water and dumping it in the water, and therefore you can have a hot shower with that. So that's again a very efficient technology, much cheaper to run than a gas appliance. May cost a little bit more upfront. So sort of a bit of a theme with electrification is that often the upfront cost is a bit higher, but the running cost is much lower. So there's a bit of a shift from in terms of operating cost to capital cost, if you like, if you think about it
Yeah.
in those terms. And so there's some of the work that we do, for example, is on innovative financing mechanisms to make that easier for people to make that transition. And then the third one in the home is and it's often it's the kind of the last one often that people target, which is the cooking, because people love cooking with gas. In fact, that the saying "you're cooking with gas" is a saying that comes from the gas industry, which they kind of use to in the Australian context. Again, it's kind of, I always think of gas cooking as a bit like the gateway drug to get people to have gas into their homes, right? You want to cook with gas, so get the gas connection, and then hey, you've got gas now. Let's use gas for space heating and for water heating. And I've lived in homes that had just an electric hot plate to cook on, and that's a terrible way to cook.
Indeed.
Gas is a much nicer way to cook than those old electric hot plates. But modern induction electric stoves are miles apart from those old hot plates. In fact, cooking with an electric induction stove is, I would argue, a much better experience for cooking than using a gas stove. It's quicker, incredibly fast to cook with those, and they're much easier to clean, as well as all the other benefits. You're not burning gas in your home. You're not, affecting the health of yourself or your children. So that's the kind of third technology that really enables you to go all the way to fully electrifying your home. And then once you've
Hmm.
done that, you can then sort of disconnect from the gas network altogether and reduce your standing charges. So they're all kind of I guess, the energy gas using appliances in the homes. We haven't talked about the thing that's providing the energy. So that could be, solar panels on your roof, and then batteries are another technology. So we can dig into that a bit. But maybe just before that, I'll also mention the kind of the fourth one that sits sort of outside the home, which is the electric car. I probably don't need to talk too much about that because I think people are pretty familiar with
Electric cars.
electric vehicles. Yeah, they're taking off, and the reasons for that are pretty plain to see because they're a fantastic driving experience. I own one, and it's a great car to drive.
Hmm.
They're very, very cheap to run, particularly if you're using your own solar energy, for example. And again, it's just a better experience all around. So I think that's for a lot of people, that's particularly as the capital cost comes down, that'll just be a no-brainer that people will switch to electric vehicles.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are moving and choosing electric vehicles to do for their commute to work and for just going around. But one thing that I'd like to ask is regarding the cooking gas, because a lot of people may already transition for a lot of things like the water heating and the space heating, and in regards to their cars, electric vehicles. So, can you tell me a little bit more on how can we incorporate this induction stove? Because I do believe that it's more expensive in the beginning, like capital wise.
Yeah, look, they can be. Although it depends on what you really need. So if you
Hmm.
need 8 hobs and many amps of current to cook with, that's the sort of cooking you like to do. Then sure, you can buy a top of the range induction stove, and it will be a few $1,000s. Or you could go down to your local retailer, even a supermarket, and spend maybe $50 to $70 Australian and buy a single induction hob, which you
Mm.
plug into a PowerPoint. And that's kind of I often sort of recommend that to people because it's a good way to sort of test out induction cooking.
Ah.
And it's a great thing to have too if you, for example, if you're going away camping or you just you're on the move and you want some way to cook. They're a fantastic little device. They're not very expensive. And they have all the benefits of induction cooking, but without the cost. They're quite cheap just to buy something you plug in. That's only going to give you one hob. You can, I think, maybe buy some with two. But when you go beyond that, when you want sort of three or four hobs to cook on, then you are going to need an electrician to visit your home and to put in the full induction stove. So yeah, so there's a few different ways of getting there. Whether you want to sort of try out the halfway house, some people just I've seen people just put a timber board over their gas stove, leave the gas stove there, disconnect it, and then just cook with a cheap little induction hob sitting on the board.
Yeah.
So that's one way to do it. But otherwise, yeah, it's something that you need to plan for if you're planning to fully electrify your home. And I guess one of the lessons would be one of some takeaways, I guess, around electrification is maybe don't try and do it all at once. So break it down into stages and think about where the priorities are, and maybe the cooking is the sort of the thing you do last,
Mm.
because it might be a little bit more difficult or more expensive. But
Indeed.
there's lots of low hanging fruit you can do before you get there.
I see. And what are some common misconceptions about making the energy transition at home?
Yeah, I guess one of the main misconceptions is that it's expensive to do this, and that it's really something only for wealthy people. And that may have been true, say 10 or 20 years ago, but the technologies have got a lot cheaper, particularly solar panels, very cheap now. About 40% of homes in Australia now have solar panels on their roof. That's the highest penetration in the world. So it's certainly going to save you money in the long run. So if you have the capital now, it makes sense to invest in these technologies to make your home cheaper to run.
Hmm.
So that will save you money in the long run. It's for those who don't have the capital, or they can't extend it on their mortgage. in Australia we have things like green loans and other incentives that mean that you can borrow money very cheaply to do a lot of these upgrades, again, which will save you money. So it's again a bit of a no-brainer, I think, for a lot of people.
I see. And I can see that as we are moving on in the future, it is becoming cheaper to move into electrics. And as we can see, a lot of electric vehicles on the road. And for those people who've yet to make any renewable energy upgrades and they want to transition into a fully electric home, and it seems like a hefty job, as you mentioned, what would you recommend starting with?
Yeah, well, start with a plan. I guess that's the first thing, is just work out where are you using fossil fuels in your home. Maybe you only have one or two, gas using appliances. Maybe you don't have any gas using appliances. There are people who it's really just the car, right? And so for them, it's pretty simple to say, well, let's put on some solar panels that'll be part of my home, and I can charge my car during the day or just on the weekends when it's sitting at home parked. So it's not going to be the same for everyone. So I think having a bit of a plan, customizing that plan to what suits you, and prioritizing what you want to do first. So if you don't want to do it all in one go, you don't have the money to do it, or it's just too much of a headache to do it as one big project, then I think breaking it down into steps is a really important thing. And so I would start looking at, probably the easiest one is the water heater.
Yeah.
So the water heater can be, if it's a gas water heater, looking at how you might replace that with, particularly, say, a heat pump if you want to go for the most efficient technology, or even a resistance electric system if you want something that you can schedule it, for example, to run during the day and run off your solar, as an example, or you can schedule it to run when the electricity prices are low. So those sorts of technologies are pretty accessible. And then I think the heating is the space heating is the other one. So looking at getting rid of the gas, and also thinking about, like, when is the end of life for your appliances. If you have a brand new gas water heater, but your gas space heater is 20 years old, well, it's probably going to be the thing that fails first, is the space heater. So thinking about replacing that. So having a bit of a plan for when it happens, and that planning, I think, is really important as well, because as someone said to me, when you find out that your water heater is broken, you're generally cold, wet, and naked, and
Hmm.
it's generally not a good position to be in to make quick and rational decisions.
Yeah.
So having a plan ahead of time, what am I going to do when it breaks? Because the easiest thing to do is to ring up a plumber and say, my water heater's broken, and they come out and they look at it and go, well, if this is what you've got now, we'll just stick in exactly the same technology and just replace it like for like. And that's not what we want to do. We want to transition away from the gas technology to something electric.
Yeah, because we are used to what we have, and as humans, we are resistant to change because it's easier for us to do. And as we mentioned about making plans for the future and in changing our homes into fully electric, in what ways homeowners can go about assessing the feasibility and the cost effectiveness of installing electric or renewable energy products?
Yeah, well, I guess that, as I mentioned, that sort of planning for when things break down, because at that point you have to spend money anyway.
Mm-hmm.
If something breaks in your home and you have to replace it anyway, or whether it's the gas stove or the gas water heater, then thinking about that as a good point to put in the new technology rather than having to take out something that exists. So that's obviously thinking about the point at which you do it. Thinking about the cost of it is just a matter of getting some quotes and working out the cost effectiveness of it for yourself, if you like. And also thinking about, particularly if you're looking at putting in solar for the first time, thinking about, well, if I want this solar to provide most of my energy needs, then thinking about, well, what are my loads? So how much energy am I using? Looking at your bill, seeing how much energy am I using, and thinking also particularly about when am I using that energy. So if I've got a big load that runs overnight, then that's not going to be well supplied by my solar without a battery. So maybe some of those loads could be run during the day. So EV charging is a perfect one. You can run that when solar's available. For a lot of people, that might be on the weekend. If it's the water heater can be scheduled to run during the day. Or if it's even things like air conditioning, so pre-cooling your home during the day and then maybe switching off the air conditioner later in the day, means you essentially running that air conditioner for free if you've got your own solar.
I see. And we did mention about installing these systems, and what should they consider and look out for when selecting from a range of such systems or products, and how can we pick the right one for the house?
Yeah, it's a good question, particularly looking at, for example, the size of the system and brands and so on. So with brands, it's really about, ensuring you have a reputable brand. In Australia, we have a few sort of comparison websites that are quite good at giving information about, good brands and reliable brands. In terms of things like system size, it's an interesting, particularly thinking about solar systems, where the usually the systems sort of 20 years ago were very small because they're quite expensive. As the technology's gotten cheaper, the systems have gotten bigger and bigger, and installers are kind of recommending, putting in the biggest system you can, because uh, down the road you may need some of that capacity. So if you're, for example, looking at putting in solar and you don't yet have an electric car and you don't yet have, electric water heating, then think about, well, actually someday I probably will have those things, and so I might need some excess solar so that I can charge my car and I can run my water heater. So, but also we're now getting to the point in Australia in particular where we're starting to charge people to export excess solar back into the grid at certain times of day. So there's a bit of a disincentive to have a system that's too big, or at least maybe people think about, start putting in a battery so they can store some of that energy for them to use rather than exporting it back into the grid. And rather than, getting a very small credit or actually being charged for it,
Hmm.
they can use it themselves and get more value from it.
I see. So more into understanding the system that is within the house and finding out the re- reputable brands that are good for the house and small enough or big enough for the scale of that particular home. And what?
Yeah, right
Mhm.
sizing. Yep.
Okay.
Right sizing the system. Yep.
Right sizing. That's perfect. And what long-term economic benefits can homeowners expect from investing in electric upgrades from your expertise?
Yeah, well, it's just, reduced energy bills is the main one. It's something we haven't talked about, I guess, is like the building envelope and the making sure that the energy loads are moderate to begin with. So that's probably something that people should also think about. So if you really want to save money on your bill, probably start with making sure that your home is airtight and is fairly well insulated. And then
Insulation.
also, yeah, insulation is very important for reducing, not just making the home cheaper to run, but also makes it much more comfortable and makes it healthier in a relatively cold climate, especially, but also in very hot climates. So it ensures that the home is more comfortable, that the temperature is more even throughout the day. It's not ramping up and down,
Hmm.
and then obviously it means that you're using less energy. So much easier to meet your energy needs when you're reducing them, to meet your energy needs from your rooftop solar, for example.
I see. Insulation is something that we didn't tap on, but I think that is something that we can use for the efficiency of the usage of these systems in the house. And my next question is, from your expertise, what are the emerging trends in electric home products and systems that we are going to be seeing more in the future of homes?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. There's a few trends, and it depends on the technology.
Hmm.
So in the case of, say, electric vehicles, we're seeing the vehicles get cheaper. I think the big trend that's going to emerge there is what we sometimes call V2G, or vehicle to grid. So that's where you can use your vehicle to essentially power your home. So you're not just putting power into your electric vehicle, but you're actually taking power out of your electric vehicle to power your home,
Ah.
or power the grid. So vehicle to home or vehicle to grid technologies is a something that's emerging fairly rapidly. We've now got new standards and some products that are coming onto the market. So rather than, say, buying a 10 kilowatt hour battery, you've got a 60 kilowatt hour battery just sitting there in the garage, not being used most of the time.
Hmm.
So that's an emerging technology that we'll see pretty soon. I think in the we do a lot of work on heat pump water heaters. So there's a few emerging trends there in terms of gradually improving efficiencies. We're seeing greener refrigerant gases being used in them, so
Hmm.
moving away from the sort of hydrocarbon type gases to more natural refrigerant gases. And we're seeing, I think, the other sort of big trend we're seeing is this kind of sort of smart homes and
Mm.
load flexibility in homes. So that's another really interesting area of research that we're doing. So looking at how can we move away from a grid where um, we had fairly sort of static loads, and we ramped the grid up and down to sort of match those loads, using thermal generation, using coal and gas and so on. How can we move away from that sort of grid towards a grid where the generation is actually going up and down because it's relying on solar and wind principally,
Mhm.
and we need to maybe move our loads around a bit more. So flexible demand is a really big topic that we do a lot of research on. So how can we make the loads in a home more flexible? So as I mentioned, water heater is one of the big ones, and the other big one is electric vehicle charging. So scheduling the charging of your electric vehicle to happen at a time when solar energy is available or electricity from the grid is very cheap.
I see. Can you elaborate more on um the electric load, like flexible load?
Yeah, so flexible loads. So if we think about the electricity system is essentially designed so that we have to match supply and demand all the time.
Mm.
So there's these generators that sit there generating power from all different sources, and then that goes out through these wires to our homes. Where in the old model, we were just sort of passive receivers of that energy coming from the grid, and so we had to match that. So the generators had to ramp up and down to match that power, what the demand was from the homes. And so if you switch on your dishwasher or you switch on your air conditioner, you're increasing the load, the amount of demand from the grid. And so we see, for example, the grid has to be built to match the peak load that's going to eventuate from all those aggregate loads. So we see in the case of Australia, or at least some of the eastern states of Australia, we see that peak in summer, particularly on very hot days. So hot days when a lot of people are running their air conditioners, and so we see
Mm.
peak demand often in the kind of late afternoon on some of those days. And I think that things like solar have actually mitigated that to a large extent, because there's a lot of generation at times when that peak demand might otherwise be there. So we're seeing now that the generation, particularly from solar and wind, is quite variable, and so being able to adjust our loads to match that means that it's going to. We don't need to have as much storage in the system. So storage in the form of batteries or storage in the form of things like pumped hydro, are things that we need to have a little bit of in the grid. And I think as we transition now in Australia, we're over 40% renewables, rapidly transitioning to over 80% by 2030.
Mhm.
We are going to need more storage in the grid, and some of that storage will be at a grid scale, but a lot of it will be in the home in the form of home batteries and EV electric vehicles. But as well as that, I think we need to also make our loads a bit more flexible as well. And so things like water heaters in homes, electric vehicle charging, and in industry, there's things like buildings, commercial buildings. We can flex when we heat and cool those buildings. So
Mm.
doing it at the times when energy is cheapest, and the time at which energy is cheapest is actually the time at which it's greenest, because it's during the day when there's lots of
Mm.
sunlight, or when there's lots of wind.
I see. That's a very clear explanation on what that is. And one thing that I'm curious about is the V2G new that's I think that's a new technology that is something I heard just today. So vehicle to grid technology. Can you explain more on how these vehicles can transfer the energy into your house, and what are the future aspects of this V2Gs?
Yeah, so in concept it's relatively simple. So
Mm-hmm.
we have an EV charger in the home. I have one in my home. It sits behind my electricity meter. I schedule it to run. I'm on a dynamic tariff, so often on the weekend I'm seeing very cheap electricity, and so that's when I schedule my electric vehicle to charge.
Mm-hmm.
With a bidirectional charger. So V2G means we're not just taking energy from the grid and putting it into the electric vehicle, we're pushing it back the other way. So we need a bidirectional charger in the first place. So it's a slightly different technology. It needs different standards and so on, but that technology now exists. So we can if you have a compatible vehicle and you have a compatible charger, you can plug your car in, and instead of the car being charged up, it can actually go the other way. It can put power back into your home. and that power will offset any power that's coming from the grid. So essentially, you can either slow down the rate at which your meter's turning, or indeed, make the meter turn backwards and export power to the grid if the the right incentives are there. So if there's a high electricity price, it might be actually a good time to export power to the grid. And we have a number of people in Australia doing this now, including the director at the institute where I work. He has his Nissan Leaf plugged into the grid, and he's on a dynamic pricing tariff. And so when electricity prices spike, he makes money. He gets paid to export power from his car back into the grid, and then he just charges it again when power prices are very low, or in fact charges it from his own solar.
I see that's a really interesting technology to have. It's like having a really massive moving generator within the house and that you can bring around. Okay.
Yeah, it's a technology that you can take with you, right?
Yeah.
If there's a blackout, or if there's some sort of disaster, you have a technology where you can run loads off your vehicle. A lot of cars already have vehicle to load capability. It means you can run a fridge, or you can run some small appliances off it pretty comfortably. 60 kilowatt hour battery in a car, that's like a typical largish home might use, say, 20 kilowatt hours a day. So 60 kilowatt hours means you can power your home for 3 days without using the grid, in theory. So yeah, it's a big battery that sits there, and the opportunity across the country in terms of electrifying our fleet, the opportunity for plugging those into our grid and essentially shoring up our grid and being able to run our grid off 100% renewables, which is the ultimate goal. It's a massive opportunity there from electric vehicles.
Yeah, the opportunity is limitless, especially because it's a moving generator power bank if we use our phones. And we can do it and bring it when we move homes easily as well, because generators is generally hard for us to move around, for it to move around. And mhm.
Yeah, and like we're seeing that. I saw a really good example of a local council here it was in New South Wales, and they were looking to electrify their garbage trucks. So they had a few garbage trucks, and the thing that made the case for them, the business case, was that as well as obviously being cleaner and cheaper to operate for garbage collection, they could use them in emergencies. So they could use them for disaster relief. Take these garbage trucks, which have enormous batteries, and park them and power sort of emergency facilities, lighting and etc. So so just for that alone, it sort of provides additional resilience. And I think it's one of those topic we haven't touched on, but fully electric homes are much more resilient homes. So you're not relying on the gas network. You can, particularly if you've got batteries and if you've got say vehicle to grid, you can be more autonomous from the grid, and so you're more resilient to any sort of things like natural disasters, etc. As well as being having a home that's more comfortable to big streams of weather.
Yeah, that is really an interesting take, because having a resilient home is important, especially when these natural disasters occurs and the powers got cut off and gas got cut off. And that is one big concern when people go through these earthquakes or natural disasters that can actually put you off the grid. And that's a really interesting take on this matter. And one last question on this is, what should we as consumers be prepared for in the future?
Yeah, I guess we should be prepared for a fully electric future. I think we kind of I think about it in terms of as a species, we started by using fire, something we controlled locally, and then we through the Industrial Revolution we moved to this world where we took energy services from big corporations, and we pumped energy over wires into our homes. And I think we're kind of turning that around again. We're going back towards a world where we have much more power as consumers over our energy generation and energy consumption needs, and so we can invest in these technologies, and we can be much more resilient, and we can be much more responsible for the energy that we both generate and consume. So I think the electrification journey it's really only just starting, but it's certainly underway. And I think the transition away from particularly from gas appliances towards electric, will be very rapid because the benefits just outweigh the costs massively. So, as I said at the beginning, it's better for our health, it's better for the environment, and it's better for our hip pocket.
Thank you very much for explaining that very clearly. And for people who are listening, what is a habit you would recommend practicing when it comes to household sustainability?
Yeah, I think it's always like we haven't talked a lot about energy efficiency, and we used to in this space talk much more about energy efficiency,
Hmm.
and which is sort of often a kind of a sort of a deprivation model of thinking about energy that we need to sort of not use too much. And I think we're getting a little bit more into the mindset of, well, there's all this abundant cheap energy available, particularly through solar. So we don't have to be quite so focused on energy efficiency. It's more about, well, where does the energy come from and when are we using it? So, but I think it's still worth thinking about the habit of, if we can reduce the load, everything gets much easier. So if you do want to have a shorter shower, it's much easier to provide for your needs through through whatever technology, but to do it in a more economic way. So so I think I'm still thinking about energy efficiency, but also thinking about where the electricity is coming from and when you're using it. I think is becoming equally important.
I see. So understanding in energy efficiency in terms of our showers and what we do, and just be more mindful on our electronics, and whether we turn on our lamp for too long, and our.
Yeah, like
Mhm.
things like lamps and so on, probably less of a
Mhm.
concern, and charging your phone. They're tiny loads, tiny loads. It's the big loads in your home, which is the heating and cooling loads are the main ones.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, space heating, water heating are big loads. Less so if with heat pump technology, obviously, and things like a refrigerator. They're pretty efficient these days, but they do operate 24 hours a day, so they do tend to use up a little bit of power. So it's the big loads are the ones that either use a lot of power, maybe not all day, but use a lot of power, or they're the loads that use a moderate amount of power and they're just running 24 hours a day. So thinking about reducing those sorts of loads.
I see. So reducing the heating and the cooling technologies that are within the home, and how can we make our home more energy efficient in that sense, like insulating, as you mentioned just now.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Start with the basics in terms of insulation, and then looking at how you can upgrade.
Thank you very much for your answers. I think that is a lot of insights for our listeners. And now we can go into our open mic section where you can talk about anything that you're passionate about, or you might want to elaborate the topic further. And it doesn't really have to be related to the topic as well. So the floor is yours.
Okay. I didn't really I didn't really think about this too much and prepare for it, but
Mhm.
maybe sort of touching back on what sort of thing we're talking about at the beginning, where with science and skepticism.
Mhm.
So maybe it's just something I'm passionate about is science in general. I think science is a fantastic way to understand the world, and I think, uh, yeah, I think uh, you know, money for science research is always, I think, a money well spent by governments, and I think people being more interested in science is something that would benefit us all. So, yeah, I could talk a lot about different science topics and things that I find interesting about them, whether it's astronomy or biology, etc. But science and also it's kind of related to that, and the theme of skepticism is thinking about sort of truth and what we know, and particularly as we moving into a world where truth is something that gets a little bit contentious sometimes, and I think science is a way where we can actually really know what's true.
So making that curiosity for science and knowing the truth and growing that so that we can just be more knowledgeable about the world.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, David, for your insights. And if our listeners want to find out more about you and where and what you do, where should they go?
Yeah, if you want to find the Institute for Sustainable Futures, we have a great website with links to all our research. That's at uts.edu.au/ISF
Mhm.
for Institute of Sustainable Futures. And if people want to contact me, they can find me on LinkedIn, for example. Just Google my name, David Roche, R-O-C-H-E, David Roche Sydney on LinkedIn, or David Roche ISF, you'll probably find me.
Thank you very much, David. And that is all for today, everyone. From me, Sabrina Oktavelia, and David Roche. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Room by Room, produced by the Home Organisation Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes like this from across 10 life management perspectives can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your smart devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at ho.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Gabriella Yastra. Thanks for tuning in.